A storm is coming, a dust storm of unimaginable scope that will bury the history of the entire ancient world, leaving nothing but whispers of forgotten gods and collapsed stone monuments. But there is one story, just one flickering, improbable candle in the gale that refuses to be extinguished. This is not just history. This is the saga of a destiny so audacious, so utterly impossible, that to merely whisper its name across the shifting sands of time should have been a death sentence. We are talking about the very cradle of civilization, the Fertile Crescent, where kings were gods and life was cheaper than a handful of desert grit. Can you believe that the entire fate of the future, the very philosophical blueprint for half the world's population, was staked on the decision of one man wandering across the desolate sands? A catastrophe no one saw coming was the simple, terrifying act of a family moving away from the grandeur of Ur of the Chaldees. This was a decision made by a shepherd named Abram, a man who dared to look up at the impossible black void of the Mesopotamian night and hear a voice that promised him not just a patch of land, but descendants as numerous as those uncounted, blazing stars above him. This is the dawn of the impossible kingdom. Picture it. The year is roughly 2000 BCE. Babylon is a towering, bronze-plated monument to human ambition, and Egypt is already ancient, ruled by pharaohs whose power stretched from the Nile cataracts to the heavens themselves. And yet, here we have Abram, a nobody from nowhere, pulling his livestock and his small band of kin across terrifyingly hostile territory, walking away from comfort and certainty based purely on an invisible command. The stakes were not just high, they were cosmic. If he failed, the covenant failed. If he died, the promise was extinguished, and the world would remain trapped forever in the brutal cycle of polytheistic sacrifice and endless, meaningless warfare. The journey itself was a crucible designed to break him. Every mile was a test. Every drought, every encounter with aggressive local chieftains, every moment of doubt in the blistering heat was a tiny assassination attempt on the future of monotheism itself. He arrived in Canaan, a land already teeming with established, hostile populations, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the giants of legend, and all he received was a vision and a promise scribbled precariously in the dust. To your offspring I will give this land. It was the ultimate land claim, a deed signed in the heavens, yet completely invisible on earth, making him a perpetual trespasser, a vulnerable squatter on someone else's turf. But the drama intensifies immediately. The ink on the covenant is barely dry when famine strikes with the efficiency of a silent assassin, forcing the promised lineage to flee immediately to the very power that would one day enslave them, Egypt. Can you imagine the terror? They are refugees seeking shelter under the shadow of the colossal pyramids, a place where Pharaoh held the keys to life and death, and where Abram's beautiful wife Sarai became an instant, dangerous liability. He made the first great, terrified mistake of the covenant, claiming his wife was his sister to save his own skin, throwing her into the lion's den of the royal palace, and hoping the consequences wouldn't find him. Pharaoh, the living god, took Sarai into his harem. This was not a minor incident. This was a theological earthquake. The bloodline that was meant to bless the world was about to be corrupted, absorbed, or destroyed by the greatest earthly power then known to man. The divine promise, the very bedrock of the entire story we are about to unfold, was teetering on the edge of utter destruction within the first generation of its inception. But the unseen, terrifying hand of destiny intervened. Plagues struck Pharaoh's house, not the world-shaking plagues of the later Exodus, but potent, localized judgments that screamed an undeniable warning: do not touch this woman. Pharaoh, terrified by the supernatural intrusion and realizing he had stumbled upon something protected by a primal cosmic force, throws Abram and Sarai out, loading them down with immense wealth, cattle, silver, gold, a humiliating yet massively enriching expulsion. They escaped the terrifying gravitational pull of Egypt, but the seeds of future disaster were already planted. The family had learned how easily they could be broken by fear, and how dangerous their destiny truly was. They returned to Canaan, richer but deeply fractured. The tension between Abram's nephew, Lot, and Abram's own servants became unsustainable, escalating into immediate conflict over grazing rights. Two kingdoms could not exist on the same patch of promised land. The first great schism began with a simple, devastating parting of ways that would define their futures. Lot, blinded by the lush greenery and promise of water, chose the plain of the Jordan, moving his entire future towards the gleaming, wicked, yet agriculturally prosperous cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, cities whose names would soon become synonyms for divine destruction. Abram chose the austere, challenging high ground of the mountains, the path of difficulty and enduring faith. The geography determined the destiny, and the first war was already looming immediately on the horizon. Because in the ancient world, peace was a fleeting illusion, and the wealthy cities of the plain soon faced a devastating coalition of eastern kings led by the terrifying Chedorlaomer. This was an invasion that ripped through the valley, capturing Lot and his entire household, dragging them away into inescapable slavery. The covenant was once again under threat, not by famine or Pharaoh's lust, but by the relentless, brutal indifference of geopolitics and invading armies. Abram, who was supposed to be a peaceful shepherd, had to instantly transform into a desperate, ruthless warlord. He armed 318 trained men born in his own house and launched a daring, desperate night raid deep into hostile territory. The speed, the ferocity, and the sheer audacity of this single-family strike against a massive military coalition is one of the most unbelievable feats of ancient military history, securing the freedom of Lot and displaying the true, unstoppable power backing this nomadic clan. And upon his triumphant return, he was met by Melchizedek, the mysterious king of Salem, the priest of El Elyon, the Most High God, who blessed Abram and introduced the concept of the true, universal deity to the narrative with a blast of light. This was the moment the history of this small, impossible nation truly began, forged in faith, tested by famine, nearly destroyed by human weakness, and ultimately secured by sudden, overwhelming war. Now, the impossible task of securing the promised heir begins in earnest. The fate of the entire world hinges on a single aging woman's barren womb, and the ticking clock of destiny is starting to run out. Prepare yourself for the ultimate saga of survival. We left off with the crushing weight of destiny falling upon two elderly shoulders, Abram and Sarai. This was not a pleasant retirement plan. This was a direct, impossible command from the unseen power that governed the stars, tearing them away from the comfort of established Mesopotamian civilization, away from the mighty ziggurats and the laws of Hammurabi, dragging them toward a land they had never seen, promised only by a whisper in the night. They packed up everything, flocks, servants, the entire inheritance of Terah, and set their faces westward, towards the unknown terror of Canaan. Every mile they covered was a step further away from the established order of the world, making them immediate anomalies, easy targets for the established warrior kings and hardened bandits who ruled the dusty roads between the great rivers and the sea. The covenant was their only armor, but armor you cannot see is easily discounted by the blade of a bandit. But the promised land, Canaan, greeted them not with milk and honey, but with the parched, cracked earth of devastating famine. The entire migration, a desperate dash toward survival, immediately hits its first brutal wall of reality. The choice was stark: starve in the promised hills, or gamble everything by descending into the greatest, most terrifying powerhouse the ancient world had ever known: Egypt, the Black Land, ruled by the living god, Pharaoh. Imagine the sheer, terrifying audacity required to walk your tiny, vulnerable tribe, laden with silver and gold, into the domain of the ruler who commanded the Nile, the pyramids, and armies vast enough to swallow entire nations without notice. Abram knew the risk was not starvation, but annihilation. And worse, the kidnapping of the woman who held the entire genetic future of the faith. Sarai, despite her advanced age, was still a woman of legendary beauty. And in the brutal reality of power politics, especially in the court of a divine king, beauty was not a blessing, but a death sentence for the husband. If Pharaoh desired her, Abram would be instantly executed, and the entire divine plan would collapse into dust right there, under the shadow of the great Sphinx. In a cold, calculated moment of absolute panic, Abram makes a desperate, morally compromising decision that would haunt his lineage for generations. He tells Sarai to claim she is his sister, a half-truth designed to buy him time, to keep his head attached to his shoulders long enough to somehow survive this encounter with the living deity. This was the first great lie of the patriarchs, a failure born of terror. But even this desperate measure fails to shield them fully. Pharaoh's officials see Sarai. They report her unparalleled beauty, and she is swiftly taken, whisked away into the gilded, suffocating confines of the royal harem. Abram's deception saved his life, but lost his wife, and seemingly lost the covenant itself. The stakes could not have been higher. The very vessel meant to carry the child of destiny, the link between the celestial promise and human history, was now sequestered behind the impenetrable walls of the ultimate world power, destined to become the concubine of a god-king. The covenant was teetering on the edge of utter failure, one night away from disaster, one touch away from invalidation. Sickness and terror descended upon the palace, focused, painful strikes of cosmic disapproval, demonstrating to the pharaoh that this seemingly insignificant wandering shepherd and his beautiful sister were under protection that transcended the power of the Nile itself. The very air they breathed suddenly became toxic to the most powerful man on earth. Pharaoh, realizing he had just provoked the ultimate cosmic enemy by touching the vessel of destiny, did not hesitate. He threw Abram and Sarai out of Egypt, not in poverty, but enriched with sheep, cattle, and servants, a terrified severance payment designed to placate the vengeful deity now stalking his halls. They escaped Egypt, but the seeds of discord were already planted. The sheer magnitude of their wealth, ironically acquired through the deceptive ordeal in Pharaoh's court, created a new, immediate crisis. Abram's herdsmen and Lot's herdsmen, unable to share the scarce pasture and water of the arid landscape, began to clash violently. This wasn't petty squabbling. This was the first fissure in the chosen lineage, the initial break that proved that even the family bound by divine promise could not maintain unity when material prosperity entered the equation. Abram, ever the visionary peacemaker, faced the painful necessity of separation, dividing the promised land before he even fully possessed it. Abram gave Lot the choice, and Lot, driven by material logic and the desire for easy living, looked out across the Jordan Valley. He saw the lush, well-watered plains, beautiful and productive, but bordering the twin cities of unparalleled moral decay, Sodom and Gomorrah, the Las Vegas of the ancient Near East, promising endless pleasure and immediate reward. Abram chose the austere, rugged hills of Canaan, the land that demanded faith, the land where survival depended not on irrigation systems or fertile soil, but on the promise alone. Lot walked toward easy wealth, toward the bright, corrupting lights of the urban sprawl. Abram walked back into the silent loneliness of the divine promise, knowing the path of least resistance often leads to the greatest ruin. And this choice set the stage for one of the most terrifying, foundational events in this epic saga, the catastrophic, total obliteration of human wickedness, and a rescue mission that tested the very limits of divine mercy, human bargaining power, and the shocking fragility of Lot's own life. The smoke was still rising from the valley of Siddim, a horrifying pillar of ash marking the spot where judgment had been executed with final, uncompromising fury. Abraham, the solitary architect of a promised future, stood on the highlands watching the ruin of his kin's former home. He had seen the terrifying power that backed the covenant, and now he understood the chilling cost of failure. This was not a comforting vision. It was a psychological hammer blow, reminding him that the promise of a nation was held precariously in the hands of a single, aging man and his barren wife. Failure was not an option. Failure meant the total obliteration of the entire trajectory of human history. The stakes were permanently elevated after the destruction of the cities of the plain. Every subsequent step Abraham took was a walk across a field of moral landmines. He moved his vast camp south, away from the shadow of the burning pits, descending into the sophisticated yet frighteningly volatile world of the desert kingdoms and the coastal Philistines. He was a wealthy man, yes, a leader of men, but wealth only painted a larger target on his back. Every mile he traveled was a calculated risk against bandits, rival tribes, and the relentless, suffocating pressure of famine and political instability. He was literally carrying the future of the world in his saddlebags, yet he was utterly exposed, relying on nothing but temporary treaties, his sharp wits, and the fragile hope of unseen protection. In a world where powerful kings simply took what they desired without consequence, Sarah's desirability was a ticking geopolitical time bomb, ready to explode the covenant into dust. He settled near Gerar, a powerful Philistine center ruled by the formidable King Abimelech. This was the razor's edge of organized civilization, a place where the laws of property were subservient to the immediate lusts of the monarch. It worked, briefly. Abimelech, a king of high standing and great power, saw Sarah and immediately desired her for his royal harem. She was seized, whisked away into the gilded, suffocating confines of the palace. The line of promise, the foundation upon which all future monotheism would be built, was now physically held captive inside a pagan king's private residence. This was it, the entire history of faith, destined to end right here, extinguished by a single royal command and a desperate, flawed man's desperate lie. But the unseen powers guiding this saga were not done. A sudden, terrifying plague struck Abimelech's entire household, a physical, undeniable sign that this woman was protected by forces far beyond the reach of his palace guards. The king was paralyzed by inexplicable sickness and dread, realizing in a cold sweat that he had crossed an invisible lethal line and threatened a protected lineage. He summoned Abraham, furious, yet utterly terrified, demanding to know why he had been put in such mortal danger. The covenant survived its closest call, salvaged by divine intervention in the heart of a foreign court. But the central crisis remained unsolved. Decades had passed. Sarah was well past the age of childbearing, and Abraham was nearly a centenarian. Every human calculation demanded that the promise was null and void, an absurdity fit for mockery. Yet, the divine decree does not operate on human calendars, biology, or logic. Then, the impossible happened, defying the laws of nature and the relentless march of time. Isaac was born, the son of laughter, a living, breathing testament to the absurdity of faith and the unwavering nature of the vow. The birth was a miracle, a fulfillment, but it was also a catastrophic spark of immediate domestic conflict. Abraham already had a son, Ishmael, born to the Egyptian servant Hagar, a desperate attempt to force the timeline. Ishmael was the legitimate firstborn by custom, a young man who now saw his inheritance and his mother's elevated status threatened by this miraculous late arrival. The domestic tension within the tent was a frightening microcosm of the geopolitical conflicts to come, a devastating collision of rightful heirs and divine appointments. Sarah, seeing Ishmael mocking her son and threatening his security, demanded immediate, irreversible action. The intensity of her fear for Isaac's covenant future was absolute. Abraham was forced into the most agonizing decision of his life, to exile his firstborn son and the mother of that son into the terrifying desolation of the desert. The expulsion of Hagar and Ishmael was not a petty dispute. It was a brutal, necessary act of lineage security, ensuring the continuity of the covenant line, even if it meant tearing Abraham's own heart in two and casting his blood into the wilderness. Hagar and Ishmael were cast out, wandering the desolate wastes of Beersheba, facing certain death by thirst and exposure, another close call for Abraham's progeny, albeit the non-covenant branch. Only the most dramatic, last-second, heaven-sent intervention saved them, pointing toward Ishmael's own destiny as the founder of great desert nations, but firmly separating him from the central, fragile drama of the chosen people. But the ultimate test of Abraham's faith, the moment that would define him for every generation thereafter, still loomed. A command so shocking, so fundamentally terrifying, that it defies all human logic and moral structure. God demanded the unimaginable, the ultimate price. Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering. The very foundation of the covenant, the miracle child, the entire future of Israel and monotheism was demanded back, to be extinguished by the Father who loved him most. Abraham did not hesitate, a chilling testament to his submission. He took Isaac, the wood, the fire, and they began the 3-day journey to the designated peak. 3 days of silence, 3 days of agonizing contemplation, walking toward the predetermined end of his lineage and the shattering of his heart. Isaac, oblivious to his fate, asked the fatal question, the one that rips across millennia. "Father, we have the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" The dust had barely settled on Mount Moriah, the ultimate testing ground where the future of the world was nearly extinguished by a single blade. Abraham, the titan of faith, had secured the promise, but the cosmic contract was not immortal. It was now handed down to the one who had nearly been sacrificed, Isaac. This was not a smooth transition of power. This was the handover of the most dangerous, unstable inheritance imaginable. Isaac was the living proof of the impossible, the son of promise born to a barren woman, yet his life was immediately defined by an overwhelming silent terror, the possibility of failure. If Isaac faltered, if he married outside the sacred lineage, if his conviction waned even slightly, the entire divine architecture would collapse into the shifting sands of Canaan. The pharaohs waited, the Amorites watched, eager for this vulnerable, nomadic cult to simply vanish. The fate of monotheism rested on the shoulders of one quiet, contemplative man. Isaac found solace in Rebekah, a woman brought from the ancestral lands, a deliberate act to keep the bloodline pure. Yet even this seemingly perfect union was poisoned by the ancient curse, barrenness. The covenant was a countdown, demanding multiplication, yet the chosen couple remained childless for 20 excruciating years. 20 years of Isaac kneeling in the desert dust, begging the unseen power to fulfill the promise made to his father. The strain was immense, the silence of the tent deafening, threatening to swallow the entire fragile legacy whole. The story could have ended here, a forgotten footnote of a family that simply faded away for lack of an heir. Then, a miracle was granted, but it was a chaotic miracle, a sign that the struggle for existence would now be terrifyingly internalized. Rebekah was pregnant, but her womb was immediately transformed into a battlefield, a terrifying preview of the civil war that would define the next century. The infant struggled so fiercely within her that Rebekah cried out, sensing not 2 sons, but 2 entire nations locked in deadly primal combat. But the second followed, grasping desperately onto the heel of his older brother, a clear signal of his nature. Jacob, the supplanter, the heel grabber, destined to overturn the natural order through cunning and calculation. These two were not just siblings, they were the physical embodiment of a philosophical schism. They represented the living prophecy of the endless war between the spiritual path and the material impulse. Esau was a magnificent physical specimen, beloved by Isaac, the man who brought wild game and adventure into the camp, filling the tents with the smell of blood and conquest. But Esau cared nothing for the unseen, the abstract promise of God. He lived entirely in the now, for the hunt, for the immediate satisfaction of the flesh. The spiritual destiny, the birthright, the very title deed to the covenant that Abraham had bled for, was nothing more than an ethereal inconvenience to him. It was utterly worthless when compared to the demanding hunger of his powerful, immediate daddy. Jacob, the man who spent his time in the tents, saw this weakness, this fatal flaw in his twin's character, and he planned his first devastating strike. One day, Esau returned from the field, utterly exhausted, starving, weak, near death, or so he dramatically claimed, confronting Jacob, who was preparing a simple, fragrant pot of red lentil stew. The smell of the rich, boiling lentils was enough to break Esau's resolve. Jacob, cold, calculating, and ruthlessly opportunistic, made his demand. The birthright, the sacred, impossible inheritance, in exchange for a single bowl of common food. The shocking triviality of the transaction should send a chill down your spine, highlighting how easily destiny can be discarded. Esau scoffed, uttering the words that sealed his fate and magnified Jacob's conviction. "Look, I am about to die. What good is a birthright to me?" In that moment of profound weakness and profane dismissal, the entire future of the chosen lineage was traded for a handful of lentils. Jacob secured the legal claim, seizing the title deed, but the conflict had only just begun. The true prize, the patriarchal blessing, the irrevocable divine mandate, still rested solely with the aging, blind Isaac, who still favored his powerful, careless hunter son. Decades passed, and Isaac, old, weak, and nearly blind, decided it was time to bestow the ultimate, irrevocable blessing upon his favored son Esau. This blessing was no mere formality. It was a prophetic decree, a cosmic transfer of power that could not be taken back once uttered. Rebekah, ever the manipulator, ever aware of the true path of the covenant, overheard the plans and launched the most daring, terrifying deception in family history. She knew Esau would squander the gift, and she would not stand by and watch the whole thing burn. She conspired with Jacob, instructing him to disguise himself. They used Esau's rich, pungent hunting clothing, garments saturated with the scent of the wild field and the sweat of the hunter, and covered Jacob's smooth skin with rough animal hides to mimic Esau's striking hairiness. This was identity theft on a spiritual scale, a high-stakes gamble against a nearly blind old man, and the impending explosive wrath of a warrior brother. Jacob walked into the tent, trembling under the weight of the lie, and spoke the fatal words, impersonating the voice of his twin. Isaac was suspicious. He was blind, but not entirely oblivious. The voice is the voice of Jacob, "But the hands are the hands of Esau," he murmured, his hands groping over the hairy disguise. But the deception was effective enough. The scent of the wild field sealed the deal. The prophecy was spoken. The blessing was transferred. The absolute, undeniable destiny of the future dynasty was placed upon the head of the schemer, the supplanter, the man who earned his way through trickery rather than merit. When Esau returned, ready to receive his destiny, he found only the hollow echo of his brother's betrayal. His howl of rage was so earth-shattering that it must have echoed across the deserts of Canaan, a sound of fury and despair that defined the breaking of their bond. Esau begged his father, weeping uncontrollably, for even a remnant of a blessing, but the transfer was complete. The words could not be taken back. The hunter immediately vowed to murder Jacob the moment their father Isaac died. The clock was ticking again, but this time the threat was immediate and internal, a blood vendetta waiting to explode. Jacob, the architect of his own exile and the inheritor of the promise, was forced to flee the promised land, alone, desperate, running into the pitch-black void of the desert night. The dynasty had survived the outside world, only to be torn apart by its own children, running for his life with the sacred birthright clutched tightly in his hand. The scorched earth of Canaan offered no mercy. The famine did not just wither the crops, it withered hope itself, threatening to starve the chosen lineage out of existence before they could even become a nation. The birthright, that ephemeral promise, couldn't fill an empty belly. Their only recourse lay south, toward the colossal shadow of Egypt, a place where Pharaoh ruled as a living god, and where freedom was measured in the depth of the Nile's yearly flood. The journey was not a pilgrimage. It was a desperate, humiliating flight from death. 70 souls, the entire future of monotheism, packed into creaking carts, their eyes fixed on the horizon, praying the rumored prosperity of their long-lost brother Joseph was real, or they would be swallowed whole by the sands and the silence. They traded the familiar, if dangerous, freedom of their tents for the terrifying structured power of the Egyptian empire, stepping across a threshold they could never truly uncross. The moment Jacob's foot touched the fertile delta soil, the covenant entered its most dangerous crucible yet, the crucible of assimilation. They were entering the belly of the beast. Joseph, the dreamer who had become the vizier, the second most powerful man in the known world, provided the shelter, a miraculous, almost unbelievable reversal of fortune. He placed his family in the land of Goshen, the prime pasture where the Nile's gifts flowed strongest, a protected enclave where they could multiply without immediate threat. This was the genius of their survival, a temporary isolation ward in the heart of the ancient world. For 4 generations, the children of Israel thrived. They were shepherds in a land of city builders, a deliberate separation maintained by Joseph to safeguard their cultural identity against the dazzling, seductive pull of Egyptian polytheism and monumental architecture, against the endless parade of gods and granite. They learned to farm. They built minor settlements, and their numbers swelled dramatically, fulfilling the first command of the covenant, to be fruitful and multiply like the stars of the heaven. The lineage was saved from extinction by famine, only to face the long, slow threat of cultural erasure by prosperity and peace. This was the golden age of safety, a necessary pause in the epic struggle for survival. But true epic history knows that stability is merely the precursor to a colossal fall. The clock was ticking on Joseph's protective life, counting down the generations until the inevitable change. Then, the inevitable occurred. Joseph, the savior and statesman, breathed his last, and the memory of his greatness began to fade like hieroglyphs exposed to the desert sun, becoming nothing more than an obscure footnote in the grand annals of the pharaohs. A new dynasty ascended the throne of Kemet, one driven by xenophobia and a terrifying, ruthless efficiency. This pharaoh, the one history would remember only as the ruthless oppressor, knew nothing of Joseph and cared less for the ancient agreements made under his predecessor. He saw only a problem. All he saw in Goshen was a massive, proliferating foreign population, growing exponentially, located strategically on the eastern border, ripe for alliance with any invading force. Paranoia quickly metastasized into national policy, fueled by the ancient fear of the outsider. The terrifying calculation was made. If they were not checked, they would soon overcome Egypt itself. The transition from favored guests to existential threat was immediate and brutal. The pharaoh's decree sliced through the peace like a bronze blade. The children of Israel would be stripped of their status, their property seized, and their freedom utterly revoked. The 400 years of the covenant's testing had begun. Locked deep within the heart of the world's most powerful empire. The chains were not merely physical, they were psychological, designed to crush the spirit and erase the memory of freedom, turning a free people into a commodity of labor. They were thrown into the Kamin ha-Barzel, the iron furnace of affliction. They were forced to build Pithom and Ramses, immense store cities designed to glorify the very god-king who sought their destruction, to memorialize their suffering in stone. They labored under the scorching sun, mixing mud and straw, enduring the lash of the overseer's whip, their lives reduced to the output of bricks. Every brick laid was a tear shed, a prayer silently choked down, a further testament to the impossible endurance of a people determined not to forget who they were, determined not to submit fully to the Egyptian gods. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied. This biological miracle, a direct result of the divine promise, infuriated Pharaoh, turning his calculated oppression into a manic, desperate rage against the unseen power protecting them. His initial plan to simply work them to death had failed spectacularly, proving the covenant was stronger than the lash. Frustration turned to sheer, unadulterated evil. Since labor could not break them, Pharaoh decided to break the future itself. He issued the most chilling decree yet, a systematic, state-sponsored genocide targeting the very foundation of the lineage. Every male child born to the Hebrews was to be immediately drowned in the sacred Nile River. Shiphrah and Puah, two Hebrew midwives, stood against the divine power of Pharaoh, risking their lives by refusing to execute the brutal order. They lied to the throne, claiming the Hebrew women were too vigorous, giving birth before the midwives could arrive. A magnificent, subversive act of defiance against the largest military power on earth, a tiny crack in the edifice of tyranny. But their courage could only buy moments. Pharaoh, realizing his scheme was undermined, broadened his decree. Every Egyptian citizen was now tasked with throwing the Hebrew boys into the water. The air was thick with the scent of fear, and the cries of mothers echoed across Goshen. The entire history of Israel now hinged on the life of every single infant boy. The stage was set for the arrival of the deliverer, born into the river of death itself, hidden among the reeds. The Nile was not a river of life for the Hebrews. It was a hungry, churning maw, ready to swallow the hope of an entire people under Pharaoh's murderous decree. For 3 months, the most important baby in history was a secret kept by the desperate silence of a single family, his cries muffled by fear, his tiny existence hanging by the thinnest thread of papyrus and pitch. Pharaoh's decree had turned the river into a watery graveyard for every male Hebrew infant. Yet right there, floating on the current of inevitable doom, was the miniature ark, a fragile vessel carrying the fate of the world. And who finds the box? Pharaoh's daughter, emerging from the royal palace to bathe. A twist of fate so audacious, so statistically impossible, it screams of the hand of destiny guiding the current. The boy, named Moses, literally drawn out of the water, was suddenly adopted into the very throne room of the enemy, raised on the blood money of his enslaved brethren, learning the deepest secrets of the empire that sought to crush his lineage. He grew up in the gilded cage of Egyptian royalty, trained in military arts, philosophy, and the complex, ruthless administration of a slave state, a future pharaoh in waiting, the ultimate Trojan horse nestled inside the citadel. But the blood of Jacob called to him, a deep, restless ache beneath the linen and gold, a constant nagging awareness that he did not belong to the masters, that his destiny lay in the dust of the brick pits. Moses had chosen. He threw away the most powerful throne in the known world for a single, desperate act of solidarity, sacrificing unimaginable power for the honor of his suffering kinsman. The secret, however, was a corrosive cancer that quickly spread among the very people he sought to save. He realized they distrusted him, saw him as an outsider, an Egyptian with strange, dangerous loyalties. He was exposed, hunted, and now fleeing the very empire he was meant to rule, trading the golden streets of Thebes for the desolate silence of the wilderness. The harsh desert swallowed him whole. Midian, a barren, desolate land where the covenant promises seemed to die, choking on sand and silence for 40 excruciating years of obscurity. 40 years of tending sheep, the most anticlimactic job imaginable for a man who held the military secrets of Egypt and knew the inner workings of its governance. This was not the deliverer. This was a shepherd, a fugitive, a failed revolutionary, growing old and irrelevant under the merciless sun. But the silence was about to be violently shattered by an impossible fire. Mount Horeb, the mountain of God, suddenly blazing not with destructive rage, but with a controlled, unquenchable flame that consumed nothing. The ultimate cosmic anomaly, the burning bush. This was the moment of absolute confrontation between human frailty and incomprehensible, searing divine power. The voice thundered from the heart of the fire, demanding immediate, terrified recognition. I am that I am. The God who had seemed utterly silent for 4 centuries was suddenly violently present, activating the dormant promises made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob with world-shaking force. The mission was terrifyingly simple, yet utterly impossible. Go back to the monolithic, crushing power of Egypt and demand the immediate, unconditional release of 3 million armed slaves. Moses, the stuttering, insecure shepherd, pushed back with everything he had, offering 5 frantic excuses in rapid succession. "Who am I? What is your name? What if they don't believe me? I am slow of speech. Send someone else." The weight of world history and the survival of monotheism itself was being pressed onto the shoulders of a man who just wanted to stay hidden in the remote wilderness. But this was not a negotiation. It was a mandate sealed by cosmic power. God had provided the ultimate arsenal, the shepherd's staff that turned instantly into a venomous serpent, the hand struck instantly white with deadly leprosy and then healed. Signs of raw, transcendent power that could not be denied or explained away by cheap Egyptian magic. Moses was armed, anointed, and sent straight into the jaws of the crocodile, accompanied by his brother Aaron, the designated voice for the reticent prophet. The return journey was charged with electrifying, historical tension. He walked back into the land that had exiled him, not as a fugitive trembling in fear, but as the emissary of an unknown, terrifying deity, bearing demands. He stood once again before the palace walls, no longer a prince, but a messenger of doom, demanding audience with the Pharaoh, the self-proclaimed living god of the Nile and master of the world. Pharaoh was, predictably, not impressed by this ragged, aging shepherd. He scoffed, demanding to know, "Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I know not the Lord, neither will I let Israel go." This was the ultimate challenge, the ideological collision of 2 opposing worlds, the radical monotheism of the invisible, infinite God versus the deeply established, visible, self-proclaimed divinity of the colossal Egyptian empire. The first confrontation was an immediate, crushing disaster. Moses and Aaron performed their sign, the staff becoming a serpent, but Pharaoh's own magicians, the revered Kemet priests, mimicked the miracle with their own dark arts. Their serpents too writhed on the marble floor, seemingly minimizing the power of the Hebrew God to mere street performance. And though Aaron's serpent finally devoured the others, the damage was irrevocably done. Pharaoh saw parlor tricks, not divine mandate. His response was immediate, brutal, and calculated to break the spirit of the slave population. Increase the workload. Take away the straw, but demand the exact same quota of bricks. The oppression doubled, the despair deepened, and the enslaved Israelites, their hope shattered, turned their fury not on Pharaoh, the true villain, but on their supposed deliverer, Moses and Aaron, blaming them for their increased suffering. The stage was now set for the 10 plagues, a supernatural war waged against the pantheon of Egyptian gods, designed to break the will of the mightiest empire on earth and carve out a path for a nation. The stage was set, yes, but the performance was about to tear the foundations of the world's greatest civilization apart. This was not a negotiation. This was a demolition project, orchestrated by a single shepherd and the unstoppable force he channeled. Pharaoh Ramesses II, or whichever mighty ruler sat upon the throne, looked upon Moses and Aaron with the contempt reserved for insolent slaves, unaware that he was staring into the very abyss of his own empire's end. Pharaoh's heart, that magnificent, arrogant muscle, remained hardened. He was not just defying Moses, he was challenging Yahweh, and the response was an immediate escalation. Next came the frogs, not a few scattered amphibians, but a suffocating carpet of leaping, slimy life that burst from the river and infested every corner of the kingdom. They were in the ovens, in the beds, in the very water jars. This was a direct, humiliating assault on Hecate, the frog-headed goddess of fertility and resurrection. Egypt was silenced by the endless, throbbing chorus of unholy chaos. The filth continued. The dust of the earth, usually mundane, was weaponized, turning into biting, relentless clouds of gnats or lice that covered man and beast, a vile parasite that defied the most meticulous Egyptian cleanliness. Unlike the blood and the frogs, the magicians could not replicate this microscopic terror. Their muttered spells failed. Their power was neutralized by the very dust beneath their feet. They conceded defeat, whispering, "This is the finger of God," a declaration that Pharaoh promptly ignored, binding his fate tighter to destruction. Then came the flies, a buzzing, maddening storm that descended upon the houses and the land. Yet, and this was the terrifying new development, the land of Goshen, where the Hebrews lived, remained miraculously untouched. The separation was now physical, undeniable, a line drawn in the sand by a cosmic hand, distinguishing the covenant people from the doomed empire. Pharaoh was shown the proof, but he scoffed, trusting the might of his armies more than the evidence before his eyes. The plagues now targeted Egypt's wealth and future, the livestock. A swift and horrifying pestilence swept through the fields, striking down horses, camels, cattle, sheep, and goats. The sacred bull god, Apis, the living embodiment of Ptah, was rendered powerless as his earthly representations dropped dead in the thousands. The economic backbone of the nation was shattered in a single silent night of death. Still, Pharaoh refused to yield, his stubbornness becoming a national calamity. The sky itself turned against them. Thunder, fire, and hail, a paradoxical storm of liquid ice and burning energy, rained down with unprecedented violence, shattering every tree and crop left standing in the fields. It was an attack on Nut, the sky goddess, and Seth, the god of storms. The destruction was comprehensive, leaving the land barren. Yet again, Goshen was protected. The Egyptians who listened to Moses saved their few remaining slaves and livestock, a small crack of doubt appearing in the monolithic structure of their denial. The locusts followed the hail, a biological apocalypse that devoured every scrap the hail had spared, plunging Egypt into instant, devastating famine. The land became a moving, chitinous mass that consumed everything green, leaving behind a moonscape of brown dust and despair. The psychological pressure mounted, but Pharaoh, temporarily weakened, would promise freedom only to snap back into tyranny as soon as the locusts vanished. Then came the darkness. 3 full days of absolute smothering blackness, so thick that it could be felt, a terrifying negation of light that paralyzed the entire nation. Ra, the great sun god, the most powerful deity of the Egyptian pantheon, the cosmic justification for Pharaoh's very existence, was utterly extinguished. Pharaoh's divinity was literally swallowed by the void. This was the ultimate humiliation, forcing the tyrant to offer a partial release. The people could leave, but the livestock must remain. A final desperate attempt to retain economic leverage. At midnight, the cry went up. Every home in Egypt, from the palace of Pharaoh to the dungeon of the slave, suffered the same irreversible loss. The air, the strength, the future of the nation was annihilated. Pharaoh's will finally, utterly broke. "Go! Get out!" he screamed, driving the Israelites into the desert, not merely granting freedom, but begging them to take their God with them, just to stop the destruction. The Exodus was a logistical nightmare. 2 million people, a vast mixed multitude of Hebrews and Egyptians who had seen the power and chose the winner, streaming out of the capital. They plundered Egypt, taking gold, silver, and clothing, effectively seizing the back wages of 4 centuries of slave labor. There was no time for bread to rise. They marched with unleavened dough, the haste of their departure forever etched into their memory. But the tyrant's heart is fickle. No sooner had they vanished into the desert haze than Pharaoh regretted the loss of his workforce. The elite army, 600 chosen chariots, the unstoppable iron fist of Egypt, were mobilized. They chased the columns of fleeing slaves, determined to drag them back into bondage or to exterminate them outright. The Israelites, burdened by children, animals, and the sheer weight of their numbers, were trapped. Ahead lay the Yam Suf, the Sea of Reeds, an impassable, watery barrier. To the flanks were mountains and desert. Behind them thundered the war machine of the mightiest empire on earth, gleaming bronze and sharpened steel, closing the gap with terrifying speed. Panic seized the people. They cried out, blaming Moses, wishing they had died as slaves rather than facing annihilation on this desolate shore. The existential fragility of the covenant was at its peak. A single wave of chariots would erase the entire future of monotheism. But Moses raised his staff over the waters, not in supplication, but in command. The sea split, a terrifying, impossible corridor opening between walls of solid water, held back by an unseen force. They walked across the seabed, the dust beneath their feet dry, the sound of the approaching chariots deafening behind them. They crossed, a nation walking through the very laws of physics suspended for their sake, while the Egyptian army, blinded by the pillar of cloud and fire, followed them into the impossible chasm. It was the final, devastating, absolute defeat. The greatest army on earth had been swallowed by the waves, but victory in the battlefield meant nothing against the grinding, relentless terror of the desert. 30 days after watching the waters crash down, the shock of freedom wore off, replaced by the acute, agonizing reality of thirst under a sun that promised death with every rising. They were free, yes, but freedom felt suspiciously like a slow, agonizing execution by dehydration, trapped between the impossible Red Sea and an endless expanse of scorching sand. Then came Mara, where the water was so intensely bitter it was utterly undrinkable, a cruel, mocking test that seemed to confirm their worst fears. Perhaps this God had rescued them only to let them die slowly, humiliatingly in the wilderness. The constant miracles were now required just to keep them alive for another hour. They demanded bread, not in requests, but in screaming, mutinous protests against the invisible hand that saved them. And the heavens answered by raining down not judgment, but manna, a sweet, mysterious, crystalline food that appeared every morning like clockwork, the daily bread of utter dependence. Every sunrise became an impossible provision. They arrived at Rephidim only to face yet another, more terrifying threat. The Amalekites, the first ruthless barbarian tribe determined to extinguish the Israelites before they could even establish their identity. This was not a test of faith, but a fight for biological survival against a brutal, relentless foe determined to cut off the stragglers and the weak. Moses, elevated on a hillside, held the staff of God above his head, and only when the rod was raised did the fledgling army below prevail against the vicious onslaught, demonstrating that this was a war fought not by human strength, but by spiritual endurance, a battle won through agonizing, constant physical commitment to the transcendent power. Then came Sinai, a mountain that erupted, not with magma, but with the very presence of the Almighty, shattering the silence of the wasteland with a roar that echoed through history and cracked the foundation of the earth. The mountain became a terrifying, smoking volcano of sanctity, ringed by boundaries that meant instant, fatal obliteration for anyone who dared to cross them, even a single goat or dog who accidentally strayed too close to the boundary. The people huddled at the base, watching the lightning carve jagged paths through the thick, lethal cloud that engulfed the summit, the sound of the trumpet blast growing louder, impossibly louder, signaling a confrontation between mortal man and infinite consuming power. This was not a friendly invitation. This was the establishment of an unbreakable cosmic contract delivered in fire and smoke, demanding absolute loyalty. Moses ascended into the dense, terrifying cloud, disappearing into a realm where the laws of time and space warped, leaving the masses below to stare at a silent, terrifying mountain that held their future hostage for 40 agonizing days and 40 terrifying nights. But human memory is a terrifyingly short thing, shorter even than the time it took for the stone tablets to be carved by the finger of God. As Moses communed with eternity, receiving the very blueprint for civilized existence, the people below succumbed to the deepest, most primal fear of abandonment, convinced their leader had perished in the terrifying celestial fire. They demanded a God they could see, a God they could touch, a deity that didn't demand radical, terrifying obedience to an invisible, unknowable authority dwelling in a cloud. They stripped themselves of the gold liberated from Egypt, transforming the spoils of their great escape into a grotesque, blasphemous mockery of the Egyptian bull cult they had supposedly escaped, the golden calf. Aaron, the high priest and brother of the liberator, stood paralyzed by the sheer, overwhelming anarchy of the masses, caving to their demands and cementing one of the greatest acts of national betrayal in religious history.